Hello, welcome to episode 3 of Latter-day Illumination. We're your hosts, Aaron and Kristen. Our last couple of episodes have described the visionary world of Joseph Smith by sharing other 19th century visionary accounts from those who also saw heavenly visions. We also shared examples of this visionary culture of the Second Great Awakening prevalently found in the Book of Mormon text. Today, we will discuss angelic influence in Latter-day belief. Our hope is that Latter-day Illumination can be a positive source for learning and discovery. Thanks for joining us. Have you noticed or asked yourself why visions of God and angels were prevalent during the early years of the church, but aren't reported today? In this episode, we will review angelic experiences important to early Latter-day Saints living in the 19th century. We will also discuss how modern-day Latter-day Saints describe spiritual conversion experiences. We will begin with an example from a popular Western New York evangelist of the Second Great Awakening named Charles Finney. In a sermon titled Divine Manifestations, Finney emphasizes the anticipated conversion experience one can have by seeing heavenly beings. He taught, "It would seem that it must mean something more than is commonly meant by faith, for the word manifest refers our minds rather to sight than to faith. I will do more, Christ seems to say, than make you believe. I will make you see. Your apprehensions of God and His Son shall be most vivid. It shall be as if you saw with open vision. This shall be more than mere faith." Charles Finney gives 5 conditions one must follow in order to receive a heavenly vision. The conditions, then, briefly of these manifestations are: 1. Full-hearted obedience to all known duty. 2. Walking in faith, love, and obedience. 3. Taking hold of God's promise for this very blessing. 4. Wait earnestly and in confidence, honestly and earnestly meeting every revealed condition. 5. Then shall the blessing be given. Finney states, after meeting these conditions, the recipient has an assurance that they are not deceived and that the heavenly manifestation is actual. As a seeker, Joseph Smith heard spiritual leaders of his day sharing their own heavenly visions and admonishing others to follow the steps necessary to give up their sins and receive their own heavenly conversion experience. Charles Finney continues his sermon by sharing his own vision of Jesus. He states, "I have often in your presence alluded to the circumstances attending my own conversion. When Christ first revealed himself to me, I certainly seemed to see him, and to rush and fall at his feet, as real as if I were to turn about now and fall at Brother Mayhem's feet. I felt a powerful drawing of soul towards him, as if my very soul would be drawn out of me. I rushed into a private room, and there I seemed to meet him. There, so it seemed, was Jesus, the very Savior." We can see that the spiritual worldview of the Second Great Awakening was very different than that of today. Preachers like Charles Finney regularly shared visionary experiences they had with deity and admonished seekers to expect, by faith, to have similar angelic visionary conversion experiences, which they did. This visionary culture existed in early Latter-day Saint meetings. Joseph Smith described the experience at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple as follows. "Brother George A. Smith rose and began to prophesy, when a noise was heard like the sound of a rushing wind, which filled the temple, and all the congregation simultaneously arose. Being moved upon by an invisible power, many began to speak in tongues and prophesy. Others saw glorious visions, and I beheld the temple was filled with angels, which fact I declared to the congregation." George A. Smith gives a report of the temple dedication in Kirtland, Ohio in 1836. "There were great manifestations of power, such as speaking in tongues, seeing visions, administration of angels. Many individuals bore testimony that they saw angels, and David Whitmer bore testimony that he saw 3 angels passing up the south aisle, and there came a shock in the house like a sound of mighty rushing wind, and almost every man in the house arose, and hundreds of them were speaking in tongues, prophesying or declaring visions almost with one voice."
Central to the Second Great Awakening were the efforts in hastening the millennium or second coming of Jesus. Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, founding fathers of the American Restoration Movement from the years of 1790 to 1840, sought to unify all Christian denominations into one body, patterned after the original church of the New Testament. Efforts to restore the ancient patterns practiced in the primitive church were familiar to seekers of the day. The need to restore the church of the New Testament was not unique to Latter-day Saints. One element that did make the Mormon movement unique was the claim of receiving direct authority through angelic messengers found in biblical text. This was a captivating concept to seekers of the day because it addressed some central controversial questions had by Protestant seekers pertaining to who has authority. For example, who has authority to baptize? The visionary worldview of the Second Great Awakening is very influential in present-day Latter-day belief. Many core doctrines are directly connected to reports of biblical persons manifesting themselves as angelic visitors to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. Some of these angelic messengers include John the Baptist, Peter, James, John, Elijah, Moses, and Jesus. Angelic visitations are directly connected with modern-day belief in a literal priesthood restoration, as well as central to the belief in sealing power and temple work for both the living and dead. For Latter-day Saints, these angelic visitations are viewed as literal and necessary in preparing for the millennium or second coming of Jesus. Sidney Rigdon, a famous preacher in northern Ohio during the American Restoration Movement in the 1820s, was passionate about his theological views. From a young age, Rigdon was closely associated with Thomas and Alexander Campbell, founding fathers of the American Restoration Movement. Alexander Campbell said of Rigdon, "He was exceedingly fond of new ideas and always boasting of originality. Rigdon sought distinction by his study on the prophecies." Over time, Sidney Rigdon began to disagree with Alexander Campbell on some points of Reformation. These 3 points of doctrine were the restoration of supernatural gifts of the Spirit, incorporation of miracles, and living in a communal society where all property was held in common, as described in the New Testament book of Acts. Campbell didn't agree with Rigdon on the restoration of supernatural gifts and miracles and wanted no economic experiments which involved communal life within his religious sect. These points would become some of the major distinctions in what set the Latter-day Saints apart from the Stone Campbell movement. Sidney broke with Alexander Campbell, and he, along with hundreds of his Campbellite congregants, joined with Joseph Smith only a short 7 miles north in Kirtland, Ohio, in the fall of 1830. Several individuals who followed Sidney Rigdon into the Mormon movement became prominent leaders such as John Murdoch, Lyman White, Orson Hyde, Edward Partridge, Newell K. Whitney, Parley P. Pratt, Frederick G. Williams, Isaac Morley, and Lorenzo and Eliza Snow. The Mormon movement was a perfect fit for Sidney Rigdon to adopt as his own, as he had with the Campbellites, or formerly known as the Disciples of Christ. With the Latter-day Saints, Sidney could apply his passionate theological convictions, particularly those of supernatural gifts of the Spirit, miracles, and communal living. As a skilled religious organizer, biblical scholar, and missionary, Rigdon was highly valuable to Joseph Smith. His conversion alone nearly doubled the church membership in a matter of a few weeks' time. Within the first 6 months of Rigdon formally joining Joseph Smith, the Reflector newspaper of Palmyra, New York, printed February 14, 1831, reports Sidney Rigdon claiming that Joseph Smith received authority that was gone for 1,500 years. Because this event was not recorded or spoken of in any form by Joseph Smith or Oliver Cowdery before that time, one may conclude that the idea of literal priesthood restoration by biblical angelic visitors could have been one of Sidney Rigdon's original ideas, spoken of by Alexander Campbell. Also, immediately after joining the Mormon movement in the fall of 1830, Rigdon helped implement the law of consecration. This was a communal law described as a commandment in the Latter-day Saint movement, which adherents promised to dedicate their lives and material substance to the church. Interesting to note, these new ideas introduced at that particular time are 2 specific points of doctrine which caused Sidney to separate himself from Alexander Campbell. We can see Sidney Rigdon's immediate impact on the Mormon movement. The Latter-day Saints were not the only religious sect incorporating the practice of communal living. In the early 19th century, many Americans attempted to create utopian societies. Among these were the Shakers, the Oneida community, and the Latter-day Saints. Communal living was an effort to create a better way of life. Most of those attracted to utopian communities had been profoundly influenced by evangelical Protestantism during the Second Great Awakening. Revivalism left them wanting to further reform society. In Richard Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, he expounds on this topic by saying, in establishing his Zion, Joseph joined a large company of utopian community builders. Between 1787 and 1860, 137 communitarian experiments were undertaken in the United States. These communities adhered to various socialist ideas and were considered radical because members were wanting to create a new social order rather than reform the old. For the Latter-day Saints, they sought to create Zion, or New Jerusalem, where members were instructed to give all they had to the church and sought to recapture the purity of heart that existed in the primitive church in preparation for the Second Coming. Continued efforts to live the law of consecration in this manner were discontinued a short time later in 1833.
There are two claims of angelic visitations in connection to a literal priesthood restoration by angelic laying on of hands in the Mormon movement. The first is the visit from John the Baptist to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, where John is said to have restored the original authority and keys of the Aaronic priesthood from biblical times. The second is the angelic visitation of Peter, James, and John, appearing at a later date which is unknown, to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, said to have restored additional priesthood keys of the Melchizedek priesthood. In November of 1831, it was decided to publish Joseph's revelations for the first time in what would be called the Book of Commandments. Richard Bushman explains, ever since 1828, he had recorded the words he believed came to him from God, and the stack of manuscripts with the revealed words on them was growing. The title page, as it appeared in the 1833 publication, calls the volume a Book of Commandments for the government of the Church of Christ, organized according to the law on April 6, 1830. The Book of Commandments contained 160 printed pages of 65 revelations that Joseph Smith had recorded from 1828 to 1833. These revelations, originally printed as the Book of Commandments, were again printed in 1835 into a new compilation of revelations called the Doctrine and Covenants. The 1833 Book of Commandments reveals nothing of an 1829 priesthood restoration by angelic messengers John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John. However, when the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants was published, this pre-existing revelation in chapter 28 became the new section 50, now with newly inserted verses. 13 new verses were retrofitted into the original 1830 revelation describing a priesthood restoration of authority or keys of the kingdom. These new verses mention several ancient figures including Moroni, Elias, Zacharias, John the Baptist, Elijah, Joseph of the Old Testament, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, Michael, Peter, James, and John. The title page of the Book of Commandments says, for the government of the Church of Christ, organized according to the law on the 6th of April, 1830. One may ask why such significant events containing angelic messengers and restoring of priesthood keys would not have been recorded in any of the revelations in the 1833 Book of Commandments. This event was also not known by church leaders, members, or printed in any church newspaper of the time until 5 years after its claimed occurrence. Oliver Cowdery was the first to recount the story of John the Baptist's visitation in an 1834 church newspaper of which he was the editor. Historian Richard Bushman acknowledges the delayed report by saying, not until writing his 1832 history did Joseph include reception of the holy priesthood by the ministering of angels to administer the letter of the gospel. This, among cardinal events of his history, is a glancing reference at best. The late appearance of these accounts raises the possibility of later fabrication. David Whitmer, one of the earliest members of the church, commented on the priesthood restoration during an interview. I never heard that an angel had ordained Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until the year 1834, 35, or 36 in Ohio. I do not believe that John the Baptist ever ordained Joseph and Oliver. These monumental events of angelic priesthood restoration are well known to modern-day Latter-day Saints, but were not known to the early members of the Church until the year 1834. In addition, those joining the Latter-day Saint movement in 1830 were unaware of Joseph's first vision or that of angelic priesthood restoration. Today, these angelic claims serve as the foundation for individual conversion in the testimonies of Latter-day Saints. During the 1800s, angelic manifestations were encouraged and promised by church leaders to faithful and obedient seekers. Spiritual visionary experiences were prevalently sought after and expected to be experienced during this time. Let's compare the two styles of spiritual exhortations and promises made in sermons during Joseph Smith's lifetime as compared to those of today. The following exchange is a helpful reflection of how modern-day Latter-day Saints understand angelic conversion experiences of the past and how they are understood in their lives today. In a stake youth fireside held in Bellevue, Washington on January 23, 2016, a young woman asked Elder Dallin H. Oakes an interesting question. My question is, what should we pray for to receive the same testimony, if not conversion, that Alma the Younger experienced? The girl was referring to an angelic visitation described in a popular conversion story found in the Book of Mormon. Those in attendance understood what she was suggesting and chuckled at her question. Elder Oakes replied by saying, I don't think that you are likely to have that kind of experience that Alma the Younger had. Remember, he had a miraculous appearance of an angel and really got hit over the head spiritually. Most of us don't have that kind of experience. Elder Oakes continues by shifting the emphasis of the question away from a visionary nature, saying, I interpret your question being instead, how can we get that kind of testimony he received? I don't think we'll get it like Paul did when an angel appeared to him, or Alma the Younger who had a startling experience. Those type of experiences are recorded in the scriptures to catch our attention. He continues by saying, I've never had an experience like that, and I don't know anyone among the First Presidency or Quorum of the 12 who has had that kind of experience. Yet everyone can know with a certainty the things that Alma knew, for the testimony settles upon us gradually. That's how I got my testimony. Today, Latter-day Saint leaders admonish members to seek their own conversion experiences. We observe that the modern-day exhortation for conversion does not reflect the same visionary culture Joseph Smith and others experienced during the Second Great Awakening. Elder Oakes shares 6 important steps in seeking a spiritual conversion experience in modern times. 1. One must have a desire to receive a witness. 2. Pray, asking the Lord for understanding through the Spirit. 3. Study the Scriptures. 4. Go to church. 5. Do your duty. And 6. Partake of the sacrament. In sharing his own conversion experience, Elder Oakes says, Before I read the scriptures, I pray and ask the Lord that His Spirit can help me understand, and then you listen, because revelation comes not as Alma the Younger got it, with an angel to hit you over the head. That was a big deal. Revelation comes in a still small voice. You hear it when you pray, study the scriptures, go to church, do your duty, and partake of the sacrament. That's how to have the result that Alma the Younger had. We observe Latter-day Saints, past and present, have coordinating conversion experiences which reflect the specific admonishing of their spiritual leaders in the day and time in which they live. Joseph Smith's conversion experiences reflect the admonishing of the evangelical preachers of the Second Great Awakening. Modern-day members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also have spiritual experiences which reflect the specific admonishing of church leaders and teachers today. We observe these same conditions exist in various religious cultures worldwide. The question from the young woman may be one you've asked yourself. In modern times, as indicated by elder oaks in the audience at the fireside, the idea of receiving a witness by angelic visitation is now perceived as very unlikely. However, this certainly was not the spiritual climate or experiences had by Latter-day Saints during the Second Great Awakening. We observe that angelic visitations during the Second Great Awakening, particularly the Latter-day Saint movement, were meaningful and not uncommon. The culture gave way to many seekers expecting by faith to experience heavenly visions.
At the core of Latter-day belief are practices, commandments, and doctrines, including eternal plural marriage, that come directly from angelic messengers during the early 19th century. We can also read many experiences told by early church members, which include visitation of angelic visitors or heavenly messengers. In the 21st century, Latter-day Saint leaders do not claim heavenly visions as they once did in the early days of the church, nor do they admonish members to seek for such experiences. Rather, leaders claim to receive testimony through obedience and a witness of the Holy Ghost. Members receive their own conversion by following the steps and admonishing set forth by present-day leaders. It's an interesting observation that spiritual seekers or followers of every faith throughout time often receive the experience they are encouraged to have by their spiritual teachers. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Latter-day Illumination. Tune in next time as we continue to contextualize the Latter-day movement in the 19th century.